So what comes after the job? On Monday, more than 200 economists, 16 of them Nobel laureates, signed an 88-word warning. Leaders from OpenAI, DeepMind, and Anthropic signed right alongside them. The warning: AI could erase work on a massive scale. Now here's the claim I'll stand behind. They're bracing a building that's already coming apart, and nobody's opening the blueprint for the better one waiting next door. Come with me, let's get into it. Start with what was actually signed. On Monday, more than 200 economists, AI researchers, and lab leaders put their names on a statement at a site called WeMustActNow.ai. 16 of the signers are Nobel laureates. 2 of the biggest names in the economics of technology are on it: Darren Acemoglu at MIT and Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford. And here's the detail that makes you really sit up and pay attention. The signers also include the executives from OpenAI, Google, DeepMind, and Anthropic. These are the labs building the very systems that the letters worried about. They signed the warning about their own machines. The statement is 88 words long, and here's the core of it. AI could become, in their words, radically more powerful, and policymakers need to build guardrails now against large-scale job loss. And they brought data. Underneath the letter sits something out of Stanford called the Canary's dashboard. It's a canary in the coal mine type of instrument. It watches the jobs most exposed to what AI can already do, and the canary is showing this. In the dashboard's balanced sample of ADP firms over its tracking period, employment in the most exposed occupations has slipped 0.5%. The least exposed roles grew 0.2%. Small numbers, but split them by age, and it sharpens. Early career workers in exposed fields are down 2.7%. Their mid-career colleagues are up 1.6%. So the pressure lands on the bottom rung first, and you see it clearest in software. Developer job postings are up 15% since Anthropic shipped Claude Code. More openings, not fewer, but senior-level roles accounted for 71% of the increase in those openings. So yes, the work is still there. It's just asking for a kind of judgment that a new graduate has not built yet and apparently doesn't have the recourse to build. Someone's sawing off the exact rung that a new graduate used to grab onto. Okay, the letter also measures a real dislocation, and it measures it really honestly. Let's give it that. But look at what it's actually defending. The thing that it seems to want to protect is the job, the shape of it, the way it works right now. And someone built that shape for a world of scarcity. Think about a career, a credential, a wage. We designed that whole arrangement back when human thinking was the bottleneck, back when a company's growth was capped by how many capable minds that it could hire. The tasks leaving first are exactly the ones that arrangement priced cheapest. Now here's the image I want you to kind of take with this. Picture standing inside an old building that is genuinely falling apart. The floors sag, the wiring is shot, and someone is warning you urgently about the storm outside. Now the warning is real, but nobody in the room is naming the rot in the walls around them. And nobody's pointing at the empty lot right next door where you could raise something far better. That's what is missing from those 88 words. The letter counts the cost of the transition. It never asks what human effort becomes when the floor of routine work rises. And there's a number that it hasn't published. What people do with their hours once the repetitive labor lifts off them. And the very labs that signed are building the tools to produce that number. So here's the thing to watch. When the follow-on proposals come, do they name a way to actually distribute what these systems generate? An income floor, a public stake, retraining that is already funded? Or do they stop at bracing the old building? Because that tells you they have something to gain from protecting the status quo. Protecting the job as it stands is guarding a falling structure. Naming the distribution is starting to draw out the new one. Now let's shift over to a state that just started adding up the bill. On Tuesday, New York became the first state in the country to pause state environmental permits for new data centers of 50 megawatts or more. An executive order froze new environmental permits for any facility drawing on more than 50 megawatts for up to a year. Not the ones already running, the next ones. Now, the pause there is to write rules before more concrete pours. And during that year, the state's Department of Public Service writes the standards. Standards for what these campuses do to a host community's water and air. Standards that don't exist yet. So this next move tells you where it's heading. The order also opens a review of the sales tax breaks that have subsidized these builds for years. Someone wrote those breaks in an earlier era when the data center meant a modest server hall, not a campus pulling more power than a mid-sized city. The state is asking, out loud, whether the public should keep subsidizing a machine that outgrew the incentive by a factor of 1,000. And this isn't even the strict version. A tougher bill catches facilities at just 20 megawatts, and it's already cleared the legislature back in June, and it's sitting on the desk awaiting signature. The executive order moved before the harder law even landed. To see why, let's look over at Maine. In April, Maine tried a version of the same thing, but its governor vetoed it. New York held the 50 gigawatt version. When a policy this new survives the same political gravity that killed it one state over, that survival is the signal. But there's a countercurrent, and I'll be really honest about it. The EPA has proposed freezing data center backup generators from federal air permits, pulling the opposite direction on the very same lever. So the pressure is not all one way. I mentioned this yesterday too. But look at what New York actually did. For a decade, siting a data center meant handing off the water, the grid strain, the lost tax base. You handed them over to whoever wasn't paying attention. The moment a state starts counting, the extractive path stops being the cheap path, and that accounting doesn't just stay in Albany. It travels to every state house watching. Now, the same week that New York moved to slow the buildout hit the gas everywhere else. On Monday, Meta more than doubled its Hyperion campus in Louisiana, 5 gigawatts, up to $50 billion. It is one of the largest single AI infrastructure commitments that anyone has made. Meta added $1 billion in local infrastructure, and it partnered with the regional utility Entergy, and together they'll fund 7 gas plants, 3 grid batteries, and upgrades to existing nuclear. And Meta frames the deal as saving local customers $2 billion over 20 years. Now, that is the company's own number, so hold it as a claim, not a fact. But notice what the claim does concede. To argue that it's saving locals money, Meta has to treat the cost of hosting itself as part of the deal. And the hosting cost is now on the books because of that, even in the sales pitch. And this wasn't just one campus. The same Monday, gigawatt-scale sites moved on 3 different continents. In Texas, a company called Mara bought 1,200 acres in Matagorda County for up to 2 gigawatts by 2028. And in Nebraska, Carbon Black Plant courted Crusoe as a co-location partner. In India, a firm called Webine moved to scale from 10 to 100 megawatts, and NTT broke ground in Chonburi, Thailand, on a 100 megawatt campus, energizing by 2027. But here's what runs under all of that, the moment that gives the game away. In Mifflin County, Pennsylvania, a developer filed its data center plans on Friday. That was 2 days before a special township meeting called to lock in the current zoning. They filed to beat the vote. And near Calgary, a council advanced approvals for a 575-acre campus on July 7th. It did that over mostly negative local reaction, neighbors citing noise, energy, water. You don't rush to file ahead of a vote if you think the rules are going to stay friendly. Racing the clock is what you do when you already know the era of free hosting is closing. And the governance side is splitting into 2 very different things. On one side, the White House is convening data center firms and utilities for a voluntary pledge to shield ratepayers. It echoes an earlier pledge, one that 7 companies signed back in March, that critics called theater. On the other side, 6 states are passing binding rules: Oregon, Oklahoma, Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia. Those rules assign the grid bill to the facilities creating it. No signing ceremony required. And that's the whole contrast. A voluntary pledge asks the buildout to police its own costs. A binding rule makes the cost part of the deal, whether the builder likes it or not. All right, let's move over from the physical bill to a quieter one, the data flowing into these models. In a blog post on Sunday, Microsoft's CEO Satya Nadella made an argument. TechCrunch called it a shocking warning to companies using AI. Here's the argument. Enterprises that build on proprietary models, the closed frontier models that you reach through an API or through your account, end up paying twice. Once in the per token fees, and a second time without realizing it in the sensitive knowledge that flows into the model as your prompts pass through it. His words, you essentially pay for intelligence twice, once with money and again with something even more valuable, the proprietary knowledge you must reveal to make that intelligence useful. That's the quote. And then the line that makes it really bite here. The better you want the model to perform, the more of that knowledge you have to feed it. So the thing he's pointing at sits downstream of the training data. It is the residue of ordinary use. His word for it is exhaust. So here's the quote. Models learn from exhaust, the prompts people write, the tools agents use, and especially the corrections that people make when the model is wrong. Every correction is distilled into institutional know-how. Think about what that describes. Every time your team fixes the model's mistake, you are teaching it how your business actually works. That is the kind of knowledge, he writes, a competitor could never buy, and you hand it over at the cost of just getting work done. Then he names the whole shape of it here. If learning flows in only one direction, economic value converges toward the owners of the learning infrastructure rather than the creators of the knowledge itself. So that's the extraction pattern said out loud by one of the people that the extraction pattern pays. Now read this for who benefits though, because that's the honest way to read a CEO warning about his own rivals. That's one hand. He floated a new kind of AI patent to protect that consumer data, and he'd benefit from the mechanism that he's proposing. That's the other hand. Microsoft both resells other labs' models and builds its own in-house ones, the MIA models. It's already routing tens of thousands of weekly Excel and Outlook prompts to those in-house models. So, a warning that steers enterprises away from proprietary outsiders and toward owning their own stack, that happens to point customers straight at Microsoft's own offering. That doesn't mean he's wrong, it just means it's very convenient. When incumbents converge on a framing, that convergence is data about shared self-interest. It isn't proof that the framing itself is true, even if, as in this case, he is correct. So let's strip away self-interest and acknowledge that the thing underneath what he's actually saying is very real. If your proprietary model learns from everything you feed it, that's one more reason the enterprise stack keeps drifting toward open weights, toward models that a company can run on its own hardware. On some benchmarks, the capability premium of the closed frontier appears to be eroding, and now the incumbents are narrating that erosion in the terms that flatter their own position. Nadella's own last line reads like the design principle underneath all of it. In consuming intelligence, you are creating intelligence, and what you create should belong to you. I very much agree. Now over to something genuinely clever, the day that defenders turned an attacker's own safety training into a trap. A security firm called Tracebit reported this on Monday, and I love the shape of it. Here's the setup. When an AI agent breaks into a system, its whole goal is to hunt for high-value credentials, cloud access keys. The kind that unlocks everything is usually a main gold thing to get here. So defenders started planting fake ones as bait instead. Nothing new there, but the twist is what they wrap the bait in. They wrap the fake keys in text engineered as a prompt injection, hidden instructions meant for the machine to read. The attacking AI then ingests the decoy, and those embedding instructions slam straight into the model's own safety training, the guardrails that the labs baked in to make it refuse harmful actions. The guardrails then fire, the agent hesitates, refuses, walks away from the job. Its own conscience turned into a stop sign. They call it context bombing, and the measured effect is actually really striking. They ran 5 different models across 152 runs. Planting these traps cut full admin takeover from 57% down to 5%. Complete compromise, total control of the target dropped from 36% to 1%. And against Claude Opus 4.8, which is the strongest model they tested when it comes to safety, full compromise dropped from 93% to 0. They tested a deliberately broad slate to Opus 4.8, Gemini 3.1 Pro, GLM 5.2, DeepSeek 4 Pro, and Kimi K 2.6. Frontier and open-weight, both. Tracebit's CEO Andy Smith described it this way. He called it a strong, sharp effect and one that can be difficult for the agents to come back from. Now, there's an honest limit, though. Let's acknowledge it. Context bombing works precisely because today's attacking agents carry safety training. If you strip that training out, or if you fine-tune a model to ignore injected instructions, it walks right past the decoy. So this is a calibrated fix to the current generation. Both sides will adapt, but stay with where the adapting itself leads. Every step that an attacker takes to harden against this makes their model more expensive to build, more obviously purpose-built for harm, and less able to hide behind ordinary tools. And here's the structural shift. Think of this whole offensive AI story, the ransomware agent that we covered on the 7th that wrote its own ransom note, for example. It rests on one assumption. Automating the attack was a durable edge because the defenders were humans typing at human speed. When both the sword and the shield move at machine speed, velocity stops being an advantage. Defense stops being about patching faster than a person can type. It becomes about making the ground itself hostile to a machine's reasoning. Last one for today, and it's two pieces of medical news that pull at the same wall from opposite ends. First, MIT. Engineers there grew branching networks of artificial blood vessels using nothing but motion, and this published today. Here's the setup. Picture a chip the size of a postage stamp. It has a central artery of human endothelial cells, the cells that line your blood vessels. They're seated inside a gel that is laced with tiny magnets. An external magnet jostles the gel. The cells then feel that mechanical tug, and they respond by sprouting capillaries. And it's steerable, which is the beautiful part. So a gentle 5% stretch produced lots of vessels. A stronger 15% stretch produced fewer but longer ones. And changing the direction of the pull changed where the vessels actually grew. Now, all of it runs through a gene called piezo1. That's the gene that lets a cell feel physical force, and it's the one whose discovery earned Ardem Pataputian a Nobel Prize. But why does this matter? Because growing thick, functional lab tissue has been stuck on exactly this. Cells in the middle of a lab-grown tissue starve because there's no plumbing to feed them. The lead author, Ritu Raman, put the barrier really plainly. She said, healthy tissues depend on organized blood vessel networks, but state-of-the-art protocols don't enable fabricating such networks within engineered tissues. Her three-word summary of the fix? Moving is good. Now, the other end of the wall. Around the same time, a team built a model called ProLM, described in Nature Communications. They trained it on the plasma proteins, the full set of proteins circulating in the blood of 15,499 people in the UK Biobank, and it learned to predict the onset of 16 chronic diseases from a single blood draw. It beat a standard age and sex baseline on all 16. It beat the established cardiovascular risk score on 14, and it edged out a 35 variable clinic panel on 11. And here's the really striking one. A protein called GDF15 carried a signal. That signal showed up more than 15 years before doctors diagnosed the disease. 15 years. And it held up when they ran it against an entirely separate population in the China Category Biobank. That is the test that separates a real biological signal from a fluke in one dataset. Now let's be careful, though, with how both of these land. Neither is a medicine you can ask for tomorrow. The MIT vessels grew in a chip, not a patient. Turning that into a transplantable engineered organ is still years of work away. And ProLM ran on stored biobank data where the outcomes were already known. Before any doctor acts on it, it needs prospective validation. That means following real people forward in time. Both are demonstrated capability, not deployed care yet. But look at the wall they're moving from both sides. The old assumption in medicine was that you treat the body you can see when it finally shows you something is wrong. One of these results builds the living tissue before you actually need it. The other reads the disease a decade and a half before it even arrives. So the road between understanding and intervention is getting shorter from both ends at once. All right, let's bring this home. We opened on a question. What comes after the job? And the loudest voices on Monday, 200 economists, 16 Nobel laureates, and the labs themselves answered it by trying to protect the job exactly as it is. That instinct is human, and it's kind on its surface. People are getting hurt on the bottom rung, and that is real. Let's not wave that away. But listen to the whole day at once. A state started counting the true cost of a data center, and the cheap extractive path suddenly wasn't the cheap one anymore. A company had to admit even in its own sales pitch that the cost of hosting is on the books now. Defenders turned an attacker's own conscience into a trap. Engineers grew blood vessels by shaking a chip. A model read disease 15 years early. None of those is someone bracing the old building. Every one of them is somebody laying a foundation for next door. About that 88-word letter, it counted the cost of the transition honestly, but then it stopped. It never asked what your hours become when the repetitive work lifts off them. And that number, what human effort turns into when the floor for all of us rises, is the one the same labs that signed the letter are building the tools to write. So think about when the power bill lands, when the campus goes up at the edge of town, when a graduate can't find that first rung. The answer to who carries that cost is finally starting to change, not because of those who are protecting the old building, but because steadily and unevenly, all at once, more and more people are starting to finally raise a better one. See you tomorrow.